will begin the 9th lecture on Exodus on chapters 17 and 18. Chapter 17 records the water that sprang forth from the rock and the battle between the Israelites and the Amalekites. Please read verses 1 through 2. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" The Israelites camped at Rephidim after leaving the desert of Sin as God commanded. They went as God commanded, but there was no water in the place where they arrived at. They obeyed God, but they faced difficulties. God tests His people in various ways, and sometimes He gives them tests that are like fire. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 5, it says that God disciplines His people. God uses all our surroundings to discipline us and make us people of God. The Israelites began to blame Moses and demanded, "Give us water to drink." To blame Moses was to blame God. Asking Moses for water to drink was like a child throwing a tantrum. In James chapter 4, verse 1, it says that people fight and quarrel, but they cannot get what they want. They can't get what they want even if they commit murder. We fight, envy, and act greedily, but God does not give us what we want. Quarreling with and blaming Moses was quarreling with and blaming God. Moses then rebuked the people. "Why do you put the Lord to the test?" How do we test God? Is God really helping us? Is He really with us? Is He really helping us? These are questions that test God. Verse 3. But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" The Israelites grumbled against Moses, saying, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us die of thirst?" They told Moses to take responsibility of their situation because their children and livestock were about to die. Moses was a servant of God who did as God commanded. Before Jesus was crucified on the cross, He was mocked and beaten by people. He received an unjust judgment from Pontius Pilate. Judas Iscariot sold Jesus for 30 coins of silver. What did Jesus say? He said it was the cup that God gave Him. We are believers who believe in God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty refers to doing things according to God's will. It is faith that God will give me, us, our families, and our churches the best things. It says in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, that all things work together for good. Because God knows everything, we want things to be done according to God's will. God knows everything. Faith in God's sovereignty also means that we believe that God can help us with anything. Things that happened to us believers happened only because God allowed it to happen. We may be suffering because of other people. We may be ill or be in an accident. However, a believer who trusts in God's sovereignty never falters nor is tempted. Verse 4. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." Then Moses prayed to God, "The people are ready to stone me." We are tempted if we begin to have grumbling hearts. We lack faith. Then Satan begins to take control of our hearts. Here Moses was being harmed. Then God spoke to him. Verses 5 through 6. The Lord answered Moses, "Walk on ahead of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. God told Moses to stand in front of the rock at Horeb with the elders. God told him to bring the staff and strike the rock with it. God told Moses that he would stand before him at the rock at Horeb. In Revelation chapter 4, verse 2, it says that God is seated at the throne. Jesus is seated at God's right. Here it says that God would stand before Moses at the rock at Horeb. When Stephen was being stoned to death, Jesus stood up from his seat. In Acts chapter 7, verse 55, it says that Stephen gazed into heaven. When he was being martyred, Jesus stood up and comforted Stephen. God did not want Moses to be stoned to death. Of course, he could have been stoned to death, whipped to death, or left to die in hunger. Yet his time had not yet come. God needed to first deliver the Israelites through Moses and accomplish his work. When Moses struck the rock with his staff, God allowed water to flow from it. What is the meaning of the water from the rock? First, it showed that God was leading the Israelites. Who leads us? God leads us. Second, it showed that God was the God of power. The water did not spring from the ground or from a river. A hard rock broke and water flowed from it. Third, it showed that God's people live because of God. God saves us from situations that seem impossible and unlivable in our eyes. Lastly, there was a final purpose behind this. It was that we believers received the spiritual water of life through Jesus Christ, our rock. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4. It says that they drank the same spiritual drink, and the drink came from Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is our spiritual rock. In John chapter 4, verse 14, it says that whoever drinks the spiritual water will never be thirsty again. Wealth, power, and pleasures of this world are all waters that later make us thirsty. These quench our thirst only for a moment. They bring happiness only for a certain amount of time. It cannot be compared to the spiritual water that comes from God. Verse 7. And he called the place Massa and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not? The place was named Massa and Meribah. Massa means test. It meant that the Israelites tested God. Meribah means quarrel. They quarreled against God. Quarreling and testing God is a great sin. Verses 8 through 9. The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites. The Amalekites were far cousins of the Israelites. The Israelites were the descendants of Jacob. The Amalekites were the descendants of Esau. The genealogy is written in Genesis chapter 36, verse 12. Esau was Isaac's first son, Jacob's older brother. Jacob refers to believers who belong to the Spirit. Esau refers to people who belong to the flesh. When a believer tries to live in faith, people who are secular and materialistic and who belong to the flesh begin to persecute him. Even in the church, there are members who belong to the flesh and the world. They do not think in faith. Such people are in churches. In some cases, they cause big trouble. We must remember that there are descendants of Esau in the church. Moses told Joshua to select people and go to war. They were going to fight the Amalekites. Moses was going to go up to a mountain with God's staff and pray. What is the most important thing of a leader? It is to set an example. It is to lead people. However, Moses said that he was going up to a mountain to pray. The most important thing in doing God's work is prayer. War is in God's hands. 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 47, Psalm chapter 33 verse 16. Great numbers of weapons and armies do not guarantee victory in war. Our faith should not be pragmatic. Anyone who says that they will worship God only after they earn a lot of money has pragmatic faith. Anyone who tries to gather more people in the church by compromising the truth has pragmatic faith. Let's expand the doors of the church and lower the threshold. Anyone who says, let's make compromises so that more people will come to church, has pragmatic faith. God's kingdom is not in his riches or the lack of it. Luke chapter 12, verse 15. James chapter 1, verse 17. It says that every good and perfect gift comes from God. We receive good things from God. The attempt to gain something from this world is pragmatic faith. It would have been wrong for Moses to go out and kill people to win the war. A leader must first pray. Prayer is the way to victory. Joshua went out to fight, while Moses went up the hill to pray. Verses 10 through 11. So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning, but whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. God sent Moses helping hands as he went up to pray. Aaron and Hur went with Moses. Moses lifted his hands while he prayed. When he held up his hands, the Israelites prevailed, and when he lowered his hands, the Amalekites prevailed. What did this signify? It meant that our hearts and our spirits are to lean towards God. Our hearts and our devotion must lean towards God. We must give our hearts and strength. We must pray with all our strength. Moses prayed for 40 days on Mount Sinai before he received the law. We receive great grace and power when we pray. It is not enough to just say, let's work hard, let's do something. It is wiser for a believer to pray and receive from God than to just work hard at something. It says in Deuteronomy chapter 6 that God pours out his blessing on those who obey him. It says that God will give the beautiful city the Israelites did not build, as well as the houses in it. God also said that he will give houses full of good things. He will give cisterns where cool water springs out from. God will give them vineyards and olive trees. The Israelites did not make any of these. God will give the Israelites the things that others made. We are people who receive things from God. We do not expect to get things from the world. Verse 12. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. Moses became tired because he held up his hands the whole day. Moses was old. The Israelites would lose the battle if Moses lowered his hands. Then Aaron and Hur brought a stone for Moses to sit on, and they held Moses' hands up. Hur was the son of Caleb and the great-grandchild of Judah. Some say that he was Miriam's husband. This was the claim of historical scholar Josephus. When God's servants pray, there will be people who help them. God helps us when we pray. Eventually, those who pray will win. There is hope for those who pray, but there is no hope for those who do not pray. Verses 13 through 14. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." Joshua defeated the Amalekites. God destroyed the Amalekites because they attacked the Israelites, God's people. We must support God's works. We must throw away our pride and competitiveness. We must be joyful when God's works go well. We must do God's works as Aaron and Hur did. Verses 15 through 16. Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." He said, "For hands were lifted up to the throne of the Lord. The Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." The banner refers to God's victorious flag. Moses planted a flag after he won the battle against the enemies of God. We must remember that God fights for us. Let us continue with chapter 18. Chapter 18 is about the encouragement of Moses' father-in-law. Moses' father-in-law came to him. Please read verses 1 through 4. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian and father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. After Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. One son was named Gershom, for Moses said, I have become an alien in a foreign land. And the other was named Eliezer, for he said, My father's God was my helper. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro, the priest of Midian, and the father-in-law of Moses came to visit him. He heard of all the great works God had done for Israel. Jethro brought along with him Moses' wife Zipporah and their 2 sons. Moses must have sent them to Jethro while he met with Pharaoh. His first son's name was Gershom. His name meant, I have become an alien in a foreign land. His second son was named Eliezer. His name meant, God has delivered me. Exodus chapter 4, verse 20. Moses took his wife and 2 sons, and he held God's staff in his hand. Verses 5 through 6. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' sons and wife, came to him in the desert, where he was camped near the mountain of God. Jethro had sent word to him, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. Jethro came to Moses at Mount Horeb with Moses' sons and wife. Jethro went to the place where God worked, where God was present. What place must we search for? We must seek the place with the truth. We must seek the place where we can receive grace. It is the place where our spirits can live. It is the spiritual land of Canaan. Moses told his father-in-law everything that had happened. Verses 7 through 8. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way, and how the Lord had saved them. Moses received his father-in-law with gladness. They greeted each other. There are some people who do not like visitors. We believers think well of people visiting us. Who received visitors well and eventually received an angel? It was Abraham. Lot saved his life after he welcomed the angel. Moses explained everything that happened about God's help and deliverance to his father-in-law Jethro. What do we most talk about when we meet others? Where is the best place for earning money? What is the best business to earn more money? How should we educate our children? What kind of style looks good on us? We must proclaim God's salvation and God's help to others. Jethro praised the Lord after hearing Moses. Verses 9 through 11. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. He said, "Praise be to the Lord, who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly." Jethro rejoiced about all the good things the Lord did for Israel. He praised God. He praised the Lord for delivering the Israelites from the hands of the Egyptians, deliverance from Pharaoh, and for being the only God who is greater than all other gods. When we go forward in faith, God will help us. God's grace and salvation are still alive. We must look upon God even in the most difficult situations. When everyone says no, we must look upon God. When others say that something is impossible, we must look upon God. We do not rely on people or seek them for help. We must pray with our spiritual hands held high up. We must pray with our hands up. We must cry out to God. We must remember this. There is hope for those who pray, but hope is not reserved for those who do not pray. Verse 12. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. Moses and his father-in-law Jethro sacrificed a burnt offering to God, and they ate together. They rejoiced that many people were saved. Verses 13 through 14. The next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge, while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" The next day Jethro went out to see how Moses was doing. Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood in line to meet Moses. Moses was the only judge among the 2 million Israelites. This was why the line was long. It was tiring both for Moses and the Israelites. Then Jethro reproached Moses about it. Verses 15 through 17. Moses answered him, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and laws. Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you are doing is not good." Moses said that the people came to him for fair judgment. Then Jethro told him that what he was doing was not good. Jethro told him that Moses and the people would both be exhausted. Verses 18 through 19. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. God was with Moses. Jethro advised Moses to do things wisely. Verses 20 through 22. Teach them the decrees and laws, and show them the way to live and the duties they are to perform. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter, because they will share it with you. Jethro told Moses to choose representatives. Select men as officials over thousands, over hundreds, over fifties, and over tens. Jethro told Moses that matters that could not be resolved by chiefs of tens should be brought up to chiefs of fifties, from chiefs of fifties to chiefs of hundreds, chiefs of hundreds to thousands, and from chiefs of thousands to Moses. What type of people were to be selected for the job? Jethro spoke to Moses about this. First, Moses was to choose capable men. This meant that one needed to be capable to handle the job. They needed to be virtuous. Anyone who was not virtuous was not to be selected. Second, Moses was to choose God-fearing men. People who do not fear God cannot be used for the works of God. Third, he was to choose trustworthy men. They needed to be trustworthy. They needed to be blameless. Fourth, Moses needed to choose men who hated dishonest gain. They needed to be men who did not accept bribes. Jethro told Moses to not choose anyone who would judge falsely because of money. In today's church, we need these 4 types of people as well. Leaders who do God's works should be such people. We need people who are talented and virtuous, God-fearing, trustworthy, and who hate dishonest acts. such people can be true servants of God. Verses 23 through 26. If you do this and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. He chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. Jethro told Moses to do things if God allowed him to do so. No matter how good one's plans may be, he must not do it if God says no. What are plans that God approves of? They must agree with the Bible. We must not do things that would bother our conscience. We must think about whether or not something will make God happy. There may be plans that benefit and please us, but are not pleasing to God. We must stop doing anything that God is not pleased with. Moses obeyed his father-in-law. This was not a matter of pride. He needed to obey if God's works would succeed through it. This was not a matter of seniority. It was not a matter of who was first and last. It was successful if God's works went well. Hence, Moses placed officials of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. When Moses did this, simple and common problems were solved. Only the most serious and difficult problems were brought up to Moses. Even in churches, pastors cannot manage all the work alone. It is right for churches to bring up faithful people. Pastors must be careful when selecting deacons. First, one must keep the Lord's Day well. Second, one must give tithes well. They must then observe whether or not believers keep the Lord's Day and consistently give tithes. They must observe not only for a year, but for at least 3 years. Then pastors should appoint people with faith as deacons and as elders. Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own country. Verse 27. Then Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own country. With this, we will conclude the 9th lecture on Exodus. Thank you very much.